There's a version of Kelly's Heroes that nobody ever saw, and honestly, it might have been forgotten completely. The film that exists today, the one with tanks rolling through French villages, gold bars stacked in a Nazi vault, and Donald Sutherland talking about good vibes in the middle of a war zone. That version almost didn't happen. What audiences got in 1970 was a result of creative battles, unexpected discoveries, and a series of decisions that could have gone catastrophically wrong at any turn. Most people remember it as a fun, breezy caper with a great cast. But underneath that breezy surface is a far stranger and more interesting story, both on screen and behind the camera. These aren't small trivia footnotes. These are the details that reframe everything about what the movie is actually trying to say. Start with the very foundation of the project, because the film that eventually reached theaters was not the film anyone set out to make. Early drafts of the screenplay were pointing somewhere much darker. The original vision leaned hard into World War II realism, the kind of gritty, serious combat drama that dominated the genre at the time. There were no quirky tank commanders spouting philosophy, no heist movie energy, no winking jokes about bureaucracy. The humor that defines the finished product wasn't baked into the original concept at all. It arrived gradually, layer by layer, as the project shifted direction during development. And here's what makes that interesting. The shift wasn't some safe studio calculation to make the film more commercially palatable. It was a genuine creative gamble, and it easily could have failed. What kept it from failing is that the filmmakers never fully abandoned the darker foundation they started with. You can still feel that weight underneath the jokes. The tension is real. The cynicism is earned. The characters aren't performing comedy. They're tired soldiers making dark humor out of an impossible situation, and that distinction matters enormously. The tonal balancing act could have collapsed at any moment, and nearly did before production even started. Clint Eastwood, the film's biggest star and arguably its entire commercial reason for existing, grew increasingly uncomfortable during development. His problem wasn't with humor in principle. Eastwood understood that comedy could coexist with action. His concern was about proportion and tone. He saw the project drifting towards something cartoonish, and he wanted no part of that. The disagreements were serious enough that his commitment to the film genuinely wavered. Losing Eastwood at that stage wouldn't just have been a star power problem. It would have gutted the film's identity entirely. Kelly without Eastwood isn't really Kelly at all. In the end, he stayed, but the friction left marks. Watch his performance closely, and you'll see a man who seems almost separate from the chaos surrounding him. That detachment, that cool remove from everything happening around him, wasn't purely an acting choice. It was Eastwood asserting the only control he had left. The tension behind the camera bled directly into what ended up on screen, and the film is more interesting because of it. Meanwhile, something was happening on set that nobody had planned for. One of the most memorable characters in the entire movie didn't exist when shooting began. Donald Sutherland's Oddball, the psychedelic tank commander who became the film's most quoted and beloved figure, emerged almost entirely during production. He started as something minor and expanded because Sutherland brought an improvisational energy that the filmmakers were smart enough to recognize and encourage. Lines were written on the fly. Scenes grew longer than anyone intended, and Oddball's particular brand of counterculture philosophy gradually became central to the film's whole personality. The fact that this happened organically rather than by design is extraordinary. It means the movie's most distinctive voice was essentially an accident, a happy accident that production stayed flexible enough to allow. By the time cameras stopped rolling, Oddball had become the character people would be quoting for decades. None of that was in the original plan. Studio executives were not thrilled about what Oddball was becoming. A hippie-inspired tank commander dropping peace and love wisdom in the middle of World War II didn't fit any conventional mold they understood, and in 1970, that kind of counterculture flavor attached to a mainstream war film felt genuinely risky. There were serious conversations about cutting the character back significantly. The concern was entirely unreasonable from a business perspective. Oddball rejected the aggressive, duty-bound framework that war movie audiences supposedly expected. He quoted pseudo-philosophy, prioritized vibes over violence, and seemed constitutionally opposed to behaving like a traditional military figure. For executives expecting a clean adventure picture, This felt dangerously off-brand. The irony, of course, is that Oddball became the precise reason the film has any lasting identity at all. The thing they were most afraid of became the thing people remember most. Creative risk doesn't always pay off that way, but when it does, the results tend to be permanent. Look past Oddball for a moment and consider what the film is actually doing with its central premise. On the surface, it's a simple story. Soldiers go rogue to steal Nazi gold. But the heist was never really the point. The gold functions as a narrative cover, a shiny object that keeps the plot moving while the movie quietly does something more subversive underneath. These men aren't fighting for country or ideology or any of the things war movies traditionally celebrate. They're acting on pure self-interest, and crucially, the film never punishes them for it. That choice is radical in a way that's easy to miss, because the movie never announces it. The protagonists succeed specifically because they ignore the military system designed to control them. Their disobedience isn't portrayed as a flaw to be corrected. It's portrayed as the only rational response to an irrational situation. The gold is just the excuse. The real subject is freedom, specifically the freedom to stop pretending that following orders is the same thing as doing the right thing. The film was shot in Yugoslavia, and that location choice shaped everything about how the production came together. Yugoslavia offered something that Western European locations simply couldn't match at the time: access to real military equipment, enormous open landscapes, and a level of bureaucratic flexibility that Hollywood-controlled environments would never have permitted. The Yugoslav government welcomed foreign productions warmly and provided resources that would have been prohibitively expensive to replicate elsewhere. Massive battle sequences that might have been scaled back or compromised in another country were realized at full ambition here. And beyond the logistical advantages, the landscape itself became part of the film's meaning. Rolling hills, open terrain, rustic villages stretching toward the horizon, all of it gave the action an epic quality that reinforced the story's themes. These are soldiers moving beyond boundaries, ignoring the limits imposed by commanders sitting safely in the rear. The geography made that feeling physical and real. For the tanks themselves, the production faced a different kind of problem. Authenticity was important, but actual German Tiger tanks were not available in sufficient numbers or condition to film with. The solution was clever and a little ironic. American and Yugoslav tanks were modified to resemble German vehicles. Exterior plating was altered, markings were changed, camera angles were chosen strategically to sell the illusion. For most audiences then and now, the deception worked completely. But there's something poetically appropriate about Allied tanks dressed up as enemy armor in a movie that is itself constantly operating through disguise and misdirection. The fake Germans on screen mirror the fake German tanks rolling through the sequences. Everything in this film is performing something other than what it appears to be. The atmosphere on set was remarkably calm, given the scale of what was being attempted. Large productions involving real explosives, complex stunts, and hundreds of moving parts typically generate enormous stress, and that stress usually finds its way into the final product. Here, cast members consistently describe something closer to a working vacation. Eastwood, Sutherland, Telly Savalas, and the broader ensemble developed genuine chemistry that translated directly into their performances. The banter between characters feels unforced because it largely was. The production gave actors room to be spontaneous, and they responded accordingly. A relaxed set doesn't always produce great work, but when the material calls for characters who genuinely seem comfortable with each other, the benefits are obvious. The camaraderie that audiences respond to wasn't manufactured in the editing room. It was built during filming, and it shows. Telly Savalas brought his own unusual approach to the role of Big Joe. Rather than playing character as a straightforward military sergeant, Savalas drew heavily from Western film conventions. His posture suggested a gunslinger more than a soldier. His line delivery had the slow, deliberate quality of a man who's seen too much to be rattled by anything new. He treated the chaos around in the way a frontier outlaw might treat a barroom dispute, as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a crisis to be survived. Against the grounded performances elsewhere in the cast, this created productive friction. Big Joe became genuinely difficult to categorize, which made him more compelling to watch. Savalas understood instinctively that genre boundaries are suggestions rather than rules, and his willingness to borrow from a completely different tradition gave the film a flavor that nobody had planned for and everyone ultimately benefited from. The action sequences carried genuine danger by standards that modern productions would find unacceptable. Explosions were staged close to actors and crew in margins that current safety regulations would prohibit entirely. The philosophy driving those choices was that proximity to real explosions produced authentic reactions that no amount of acting training could replicate. When characters flinch or scramble in these sequences, they're responding to actual adrenaline, not imagined threat. That authenticity registers with audiences even when they can't consciously identify its source. What's fascinating is how those dangerous conditions coexist with the film's playful tone. Scenes designed to generate laughs still carry an undercurrent of genuine tension because the danger underneath them was real. That combination, comedy sitting on top of actual physical risk, creates an experience that purely safe productions simply cannot replicate. The humor throughout the film was functioning as something more than entertainment. It was camouflage. Beneath every joke runs pointed criticism of war's fundamental absurdity, the randomness of who survives, the hollowness of official heroism, the waste built into the entire enterprise. By making audiences laugh, the filmmakers were able to deliver ideas that a straightforward drama would have delivered too bluntly. Direct anti-war messaging in 1970 carried real commercial risk. Comedy provided cover. Viewers could enjoy the heist and cheer for the misfits while absorbing critique they might not even recognize as critique until long after they'd left the theater. The film never stops to explain its themes or underline its points. It trusts viewers to sense what's underneath without needing guidance, and that trust turns out to be completely warranted. Eastwood's performance deserves its own examination because it's doing something specific and deliberate. While every other major character expresses themselves loudly through jokes, outbursts, or theatrical swagger, Kelly stays almost unervingly still. He observes, he processes, he occasionally acts, but he never seems particularly invested in the performance of action. Against the larger personality surrounding him, that stillness becomes its own form of commentary. Kelly watches the absurdity around him with the eyes of someone who has seen to the whole enterprise, but lacks any better option than continuing. His quiet resistance defines a character more clearly than any speech could have. And given what we know about Eastwood's frustrations during production, that detachment reads as something more layered than pure performance. An actor who couldn't win the argument in meetings found a way to win it through the work itself. Military bureaucracy functions as the film's quietest and most persistent antagonist. German soldiers represent physical danger, but the chain of command represents something worse: pointlessness. Orders arrive confused or delayed. Decisions get made by officers who are nowhere near the consequences. Communication breaks down in ways that are simultaneously comic and damning. The protagonists succeed not because they overpower the enemy, but because they rout around the system entirely, treating institutional failure as an environmental obstacle rather than a moral crisis. The satire never announces itself. There are no speechifying generals, no heavy-handed scenes designed to make a point about military incompetence. The critique accumulates naturally through small moments, and by the end it has constructed an entire argument without ever slowing down to make one. The German characters contribute to that argument in their own quiet way. War films typically simplify the enemy into something audiences can comfortably despise. This film refuses that simplification. German officers appear calm, rational, and professional. They're adversaries, but they're recognizable humans doing a job, not cartoon villains providing guilt-free targets. That choice complicates everything. If the enemy isn't monstrous, then the conflict becomes tragedy rather than triumph. And victory over such an enemy carries a very different emotional weight. The film doesn't dwell on this tension or try to resolve it. It simply allows it to exist, which is more honest and considerably more unsettling than the alternative. The ending refuses the emotional release that war films traditionally provide. Victory arrives, but without any of the expected ceremony. There's no soaring music, no embrace of grateful heroes, no sense that the struggle meant something beyond its immediate result. Characters get what they came for, and the movie essentially moves on. That muted conclusion is the film's final and most important statement. A triumphant ending would have contradicted everything that preceded it. If winning felt glorious, The questions about authority and obedience and the nature of heroism would dissolve into comfortable resolution. By keeping the finale flat and quiet, the filmmakers preserve the moral ambiguity they've been building throughout. Triumph and emptiness coexist without either canceling the other out. Surviving the system and collecting the reward doesn't feel like vindication. It just feels like what happened. Even the music participates in the film's subversive project. Instead of the traditional orchestral scores that anchored World War II films emotionally and told audiences exactly how to feel, the soundtrack blends military conventions with contemporary rhythms that feel deliberately out of period. The anachronistic choices create a subtle dissonance that distances viewers from a usual nostalgic framework war movies depend on. That distance allows the satire to breathe. When the music refuses to confirm the emotional cues audiences expect, it signals that the film has different intentions than its genre typically does. Most viewers won't consciously register the effect, but the tone lands anyway, a quiet reminder that they're watching something aware of its own construction. Running beneath everything else is a class tension that most viewers don't consciously identify, but almost certainly feel. Officers worry about protocol, reputation, and credit. Enlisted men worry about survival, and when the opportunity presents itself, reward. The hierarchy is designed to serve those at the top, and the protagonists understand this clearly enough that they simply stop participating in it. Their rebellion isn't ideological. It's purely practical. They've noticed that the system doesn't work for them, so they build a different one that does. The film never labels this observation or celebrates it explicitly. The evidence just accumulates, scene after scene, until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention. When the film reached theaters, audiences weren't ready for what they encountered. Marketing materials had promised either straight comedy or conventional war action, and the actual movie delivered neither cleanly. The hybrid approach that makes the film genuinely interesting made it nearly impossible to sell. Critics struggled to categorize it. Some found it too silly for serious drama. Others found it too cynical for light entertainment. The mismatch between what audiences expected and what they received created an unfair first impression that took decades to correct. Television broadcasts and home video releases gave the film a second life with audiences who could approach it without false expectations. And those viewers discovered something that the initial reception had completely obscured. Repeat viewings revealed layers that single watches couldn't access. The jokes landed differently once the underlying critique was understood. The tonal shifts that initially seemed like flaws revealed themselves as deliberate and controlled. Then consider the title itself, which is doing something quietly brilliant. Heroes. The word promises a particular kind of story. Brave soldiers, noble sacrifice, duty honored and rewarded. What the film actually delivers is men who succeed by abandoning every principle that word traditionally implies. They're not brave in any conventional sense. They're strategic. They don't serve their country. They steal from the enemy for personal profit. Their heroism, if it qualifies as heroism at all, consists entirely of recognizing which rules deserve to be broken and having the nerve to break them. The title is a question disguised as a statement, and the film spends its entire runtime suggesting an answer that mainstream war movies would never have the nerve to offer. Kelly's Heroes endures because it understood something important, that the most effective way to challenge what people believe is to make them laugh first, and then let the more uncomfortable ideas arrive quietly without announcement in the spaces between the jokes.